Back in the office.
So we're up to Hilchos Talmud Torah Perek Aleph, Halacha Beis, and we spoke about the fact that the Rambam has three different psukim from which he derives respectively three different chiyuvim. The first chiyuv is the chiyuv of the father that teaches son Torah. That's derived from the pasuk V'limadatem osam es b'nechem. The second chiyuv is the chiyuv of a grandfather that teaches grandson Torah, and that's derived from the pasuk Odato levanecha v'livnei vanecha. And the third chiyuv, which is derived from Vishinantom levanecha mipi hashmua elu talmidecha, is the chiyuv to teach all the talmidim. And at this point, the Rambam asks the following question: why do I need the first two psukim if I already have a pasuk Vishinantom levanecha that obligates one to teach all the talmidim? If he has to teach all the Talmidim, then obviously he has to teach his son and his grandson. They're not worse than any other Talmidim who are not related to him. So what justifies the need for a pasuk of V'limadatem osam es b'nechem to establish a chiyuv of the father vis-a-vis his son, and the pasuk V'odato levanecha livnei vanecha, which establishes a chiyuv of a grandfather to teach Torah to his grandson, if anyway Vishinantom levanecha includes all the Talmidim and obligates you to teach all the Talmidim, obviously including your son and your grandson as well. So to justify the psukim of V'limadatem and Vodatem, the chiyuv of the father vis-a-vis his son and the chiyuv of a grandfather vis-a-vis his grandson, the Rambam says that you have a din of kedima. So that means if it's impossible for you to teach both your son and your grandson, or alternatively, it's impossible to teach either your son or your grandson on the one hand and somebody else's son on the other hand, then you give kedima, you give preference to your son first, then your grandson, and then finally at the end of the bottom of the list is your friend's son. So that, let's say, for example, your son is in Australia, and your friend's son is in Los Angeles, California. So you can't be in both Australia and in California. So you have to choose one of the two. So you give preference to your son because the chiyuv that a father has to his son is on a higher level. It's shall we say, it's upgraded to a more intense kind of a chiyuv, such that now it takes preference over teaching your friend's son Torah. And that's the law of Kedima. So today, what we'd like to study is the Avodas HaMelech. Let me just say a few words of introduction about him and who he was, because I don't know if I ever got a chance, an opportunity to do so. There was a Rav by the name of Rav Elia Feinstein in a city called Przhan in Lithuania. He was the Przhana Rav. And he married off one daughter to Rav Moshe Soloveitchik, that's my Rebbe's father, and another daughter to Rav Menachem Krakovsky. Rabbi Menachem Krakovsky wrote a magnificent, massive work on the Rambam Mishnah Torah, 14 volumes, 13 of which were destroyed during the Holocaust. One volume got out before the Yamach Shemam, they came to power. So that's all we have. We have just 1 over 14 of the books of the Avodas HaMelech, Rabbi Menachem Krakovsky. He was a Dayan in Vilna, very much influenced by the Gaon, the Vilna Gaon, and the brother-in-law, as I said before, to Rav Moshe Soloveitchik, who was my Rebbe's father. Now, a lot of what the Avodas HaMelech tries to accomplish, is to find sources for the Rambam. And he proves that the Rambam had at his fingertips, had access to amazing amount of sources the Rambam probably had a great library of manuscripts. It was before the printing press, obviously. But the Avodas HaMelech does even more than that. Not only does he find sources for the Rambam, but very often he will analyze the Rambam. And in this case, the Avodas HaMelech analyzes the question of the Rambam and basically questions the question of the Rambam. So if you had a flow chart, you would have like on top the question of the Rambam, which is, why did the Torah have to write V'limadatem osam esperechem and establish a chiyuv to teach your son, since we already have V'shinantam levanecha to teach everyone, all the Talmidim? So that's on the top of your list. That's the Rambam's question. Underneath that, you have a question of the Avodas HaMelech on the Rambam's question, basically saying that we don't understand the Rambam's question. And the answer to the question is so obvious and so undeniable that you wonder why the Rambam even asked the question. What then is the most obvious answer to the Rambam's question? So if you fast forward to Halacha Beis in the Rambam, Halacha Gimel in the Rambam says, "V'chayiv liskar malamed libno lilamdo," that a father is obligated in a monetary sense, in event that he cannot teach his son personally, he's too busy or he doesn't have the knowledge, doesn't have the time, he has to pay tuition at a school or hire a private malamed for his son. That's going to cost him a couple of pennies, to hire a malamed. But the Rambam says, "Einu chayv lamed ben chavero el bechino," meaning, as far as your son is concerned, I don't have to pay your son's tuition. I don't have to hire a malamed for your son. I have to hire a malamed for my son. And therefore, there's a very fundamental difference here that justifies the upgraded and more intense obligation of a father vis-a-vis his son in Talmud Torah, namely to pay out of pocket for the study of Torah on the part of his son. I got to pay for that if it's my son. And that certainly should justify why the Torah had to give us a separate chiyuv and formulate a separate mitzvah and obligation on the father to teach his son. So if you're following the flow chart now, at this point, the Avodas HaMelech is questioning the question of the Rambam. And this is very rare, that the Rambam would ask a question and then there'd be literature to try to understand what bothered the Rambam when the answer to the Rambam's question is right there, staring us in the face. So again, the purpose now of the Avodas HaMelech at this point, as we move down the line to number 3, is to try to justify the Rambam's question and reject the answer that we offer to the question. And in order to do so, the Avodas HaMelech writes that based on a Rambam later on in Hilchos Talmud Torah, the Malamed who's teaching Torah is not allowed to take money for teaching Torah. And that's derived from a limud of limaditi eschem bechinam, ma'ani bechinam, afatem bechinam. You're not allowed to take money for the teaching of Torah. And therefore, it's impossible for the Torah to have obligated the father to pay money to a malamed to teach his son, because that would be a violation of an Isur. So that's, in a sense, Roman numeral number 3, which explains why the Rambam asked this question and didn't give the obvious answer. The obvious answer was not a correct answer at all. And there's no way that you can say that the father's obligated to pay tuition for his son because the malamed is not allowed to take that tuition. But yet, the Avodas HaMelech rejects this immediately outright, because the Rambam in fact says, "V'chayev liskar malamed libno." The Rambam is outspoken about the fact that you do have to hire a malamed to teach his son. So therefore, to give the answer that no, there's no obligation on the part of the father to hire a Malamed and pay his tuition to teach his son because you're not allowed to teach Torah without, free of charge. You have to teach Torah free of charge. You're not allowed to get paid for teaching Torah. That can't be because the Rambam, as we said before, is explicit about the fact that the father has to pay a Malamed to teach his son Torah. So at this point, the Avodas HaMelech says the following. I'm going to read his language and I'm going to try to interpret it the way I understand it. He says, Ech, or my porach, loman itztav al beno, hare boy alfusa. I definitely need a source in the Torah to obligate the father to teach his son. Demechuyev lalamed es beno b'schar. He's obviously going to have to pay tuition. And that's the thrust of the chidush of Limadet Moshe V'Smenechem, that takes your son way beyond anyone else's son, because in the case of Mishinantom Levanecha Talmidecha, you don't have to pay their tuition. And then he writes, Ulefi Pshuto Hayanireh, it would seem to reject this argument, Ve'ef Shalom Arkein, Sharimidin Torah Asul Elamid V'Schar, that according to the Torah law, you're not allowed to take money for teaching Torah. The Alfina Mikra, we derive that from a pasuk, Ma'ani B'chinam, etc. But then, in the next line, the way I read it, the Avodas HaMelech is asking himself the following question. Wait a minute. You don't pay tuition? You don't pay a salary to someone teaching Torah? We pay for Malamdim. He says, Umasha notlim schar, that which the Malamed receives payment for teaching Torah, ala mikra, that's Torah Shvichsav, mishum shimur o pisuk tamim. This is Gemara Nedarim. Gemara Nedarim says that you can pay the Malamed. The Malamed will accept that money, that salary, for being a babysitter, meaning for guarding the children. Now you can imagine today in our time, with all that's going on in the world, that we really have to hire security people to make sure that the children are protected properly. So that's why the Malamed gets paid. He's not getting paid for teaching Torah. He's not allowed to get paid for teaching Torah, but he can get paid for watching the children, o pisuk tamim, or he get paid for teaching the children how to read properly. That's called pisuk tamim. So therefore, at the end of the day, what happens is that the Malamed will be permitted to take money for teaching Torah, but not really for teaching Torah. It's almost, imagine if the Malamed comes to you, you're the office, the principal's office, and he comes and says, well, I want to get paid my salary check. It's very important, shall I say, it's critical that the Malamed comes to the office and says, well, pay me as a babysitter. You would pay a babysitter, here in Israel, you pay 150 shekel an hour, whatever you pay, or you would pay me for teaching him how to read. Pay me for that, but not for the teaching of Torah. And this sugya, by the way, has a lot to do with what's called schar bittul, meaning that the Malamed could have spent that time doing other things which would have brought him in money. But again, he's not being paid for Torah study. And now the Avodas HaMelech says, Avol zeh eino, meaning we now do not have an answer, or shall we say a defense, for why the Rambam even asked this question. Why? Because since the Malamed is allowed to take money for Torah study, but not for Torah study per se, but rather for schar shimur or schar pisuk tamim. Therefore, we need the Torah to obligate the father to hire a malamed. Meaning we're back to square one. We don't understand the Rambam's question, namely, why do we need an obligation derived from the pasuk of incumbent on the father? What do you mean, why do you need? You needed to obligate the father to pay money for the study of Torah. Now, I think this is already my own take on it, that what the Avodas HaMelech is saying over here is that there are two different perspectives. There's the perspective on the one hand of the Rebbe, the Malamed, and there's this, on the other hand, there's a perspective of the father. The Malamed, his perspective on taking a salary is for the purpose of Shimur and Pisuk Tamim. On the other hand, the father, his perspective on paying the tuition is the mitzvah of Talmud Torah. So in other words, the Torah is saying, work this out. You, Mr. Father, you have to educate your son, and if you can't do it privately, personally, face to face, get a malamed and hire a malamed. How you work that out in such a way that the malamed is allowed to take money from you, that's your problem. You'll work that out with the malamed. The malamed will find a way in which he can get paid, circumvent the iser of mani b'chimon that prevents him and prohibits him from taking money for the study of Torah. And you'll fulfill your obligation within the context and the category of Talmud Torah. Your obligation is to pay for his education. So meaning, we can't deny the fact that the father has to pay tuition for the benefit, for the purpose of the Torah education of his son. That's undeniable. The Rambam says it explicitly. Chayev liskar malami l'bno. You'll ask me, but he can't pay the malamed. The malamed is not allowed to take money. The answer is we'll find a way to circumvent that. But as far as the father is concerned, he's obligated to pay money for the education of his son. And if that be the case, then we're back to square one. Why? Because once again, I justify and I require the pasuk to teach me and to establish that you have to pay money for the education of your son. And as I said before, that's the father's obligation. As far as the Malamed and how he's allowed to take money for teaching Torah, that problem we're going to solve. Yeah, Joe.
Just it seems like a ruse. It seems like a ruse. I mean, according to this, if you find that he's not doing a good job in teaching and you want to fire him, right? He can go to say that it's unfair. I'm watching them; they're not going anywhere. He's speaking properly. He's reading properly, and and how are you going to justify what you're doing? The way he's supposed to be understanding it. Just ask.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I don't know the answer to that question. For that, you have to know more the nature of the contract and the agreement. And again, I think what's happening is the contract will say that the money is being paid for X, but it's conditional on Y. So in other words, I'm going to pay you not just for schar shimur, but I'm going to pay you that you watch the child while the child is growing in Torah knowledge. So that becomes. But again, the payment itself, as far as the recipient is concerned, that's for the purpose of schar shimur and not for Torah study. Now, the Avodas HaMelech throws in another curveball. And he says the following. If the Rambam is establishing a monetary obligation incumbent upon the father, and you're stuck with the problem, how could he pay the Malamed for teaching Torah? The answer is, you know what? He has to pay money out of pocket for Hotzoas Hachzokas Bino Kidei Lamdo. Meaning, even if I grant you that the father will teach his son face to face, begufo, but he still is going to have to pay money to support his son, which he calls Hachzokas Bino, so that now he can teach his son Torah. If he doesn't spend the money for Hachzokas Bino, if the son is not, equipped with a roof over his head, and a place to sleep at night and food to eat during the day, then you're not going to be able to teach him Torah. But the Avodas HaMelech thinks that that is not really what it's all about. What it's all about is really paying money for explicitly, directly for the study of Torah. He says the following, that he thinks, and he's going to quote a source for this, that we have to accept a different text in the Rambam. And that is that the words V'chayav Liskar Melamed Libno Lelamdo are not in Halacha Gimel, but they're part of Halacha Beis. And Halacha Gimel will only begin with the words Mishalo Limdo Aviv. What do you gain by that? Why is that very significant? By attaching what we have in our printed Rambam as the beginning of Halacha Gimel, attaching it to Halacha Beis. What we gain by that is that the Rambam is giving two answers to the question why the Torah had to command the father in the mitzvah of Talmud Torah. The first answer is Kedima, and the second answer is Kedei L'chayvo Liskar Malamed Libno. So the Liskar L'lamed Bino, the monetary obligation, is not a brand new halach in the Rambam, but rather it's a continuation of the answer to the question why the Torah had to upgrade the obligation of the father vis-a-vis his son above and beyond Kol HaTalmidim under V'shirantom, and that is, number one, to establish Kedima, and number two, to establish that he has to pay Schar. Okay. Let me continue on in the Avodas HaMelech in Halacha Gimel. The question of the Avodas HaMelech is, where did the Rambam get this from? How did the Rambam know? What was the source for the Rambam that a father has to pay out of pocket tuition for his son's Torah study? And in order to answer this question, the Avodas HaMelech quotes a piece from the Vilna Gaon. And the Gra writes that Omru B'Kiddushin Chavtes Amid Aleph B'Mila, and the Gaon wants to compare and contrast the obligation of the father to circumcise his son with the obligation of the father to teach Torah to his son. The Gemara says with regard to Mila, Heicha delo male avuha, assuming the father doesn't, he's not proficient enough to do the Mila, or alternative, let's say he reneges on his obligation. He's in a different part of the world. The Gemara says, quote, Avua mechayve bezdin lamula. Bezdin steps up to the plate. They become obligated. They pick up the obligation of the father. It's like in baseball, you have the bullpen. So we take him out of the bullpen, this new pitcher, and Bezdin will have to find a way of seeing to it and guaranteeing that this child will be circumcised. The Gaon continues. And he says, V'lo amru kein eitzel l'lamdo. In the same Gemara that obligates the father not only to circumcise his son, but also to teach Torah to his son, it doesn't say anything about Bezdin. Why is it that the Gemara, asks the Gaon, only mentions the fallback obligation of the Bezdin with regard to Milah, but says nothing about the fallback obligation of teaching the son Torah? And the answer is, says the Gaon, de beschar komayri. Let's try to understand what's going on here in the Gaon. The Gaon is very famous for being very terse, very few words. The Gaon is saying that with regard to Milah, the obligation of Milah, in event that the father does not fulfill the obligation, for whatever reason, falls on Bezdin. And here's where the Gaon adds a few words. He says the following: V'lo amru kene tel l'lamdo, to hakol mitzuvim. Everybody picks up the obligation to teach his son Torah in event that the father does not step up to the plate and fulfill his obligation. Not so in the case of Milah, says the Gaon. In Milah, if the father doesn't fulfill his obligation, then it falls on Bezdin. What's going to happen with a child who doesn't get taught Torah? No mention of Bezdin in the Gemara. Says the Gaon, the reason for that is because everyone else picks up that obligation. Because of Veshinantom Levanecha. So therefore the Gaon asks, so if at the end of the day everyone picks up that obligation to study Torah, to teach the son Torah, what's unique about the father? What's unique about his obligation? Ella, the only possible answer to that question is bischar, that the father is obligated to pay money. So again, according to the Gaon, the Rambam derived his conclusion about the monetary obligation incumbent upon the father vis-a-vis his son from that which it doesn't say in the Gemara. Meaning, just like we learn from what it does say in the Gemara, we learn from what is omitted in the Gemara. Why did the Gemara omit the chiyuv on Bezdin? And the answer is because in the case of Talmud Torah, the chiyuv falls on everybody else. Now, if the chiyuv falls on everybody, hakol mitzuvim, then the question is why is the father obligated? What makes his obligation unique? So again, we're comparing the father to everybody else. Everybody else has an obligation. What makes the father's obligation unique? And the answer is that the father has to pay schar, whereas no one else has to pay schar. So according to the Gaon, this is in fact the source from which the Gemara derives the conclusion, the Rambam, derives the conclusion that the father has to pay tuition. So I'm just going to read to you a few words in the Avodas HaMelech. He says, Lama lo amru shebezdin muchuyavim lelamdo. Why didn't the Gemara emphasize, as it did earlier with regard to Milah, that in event that the father does not fulfill his obligation to teach his son Torah, then Bezdin has to step up to the plate. And the answer is Be'emes HaKol Mitzuvim. It's not Bezdin. In the case of Mila, it's Bezdin. But in the case of Talmud Torah, HaKol Mitzuvim. And then the question, as we said before, so what's unique about the father's obligation? Ela mishum dehacha, here in the case of the father, b'schar koi, de'av chayv l'lamdo b'schar masha enkein. Everybody else is b'chin. Okay, so now we have another chidush of the Avodas HaMelech.
So I'm sorry. So it's not that you can re-understand when it says chinam by Talmud Torah. It means chinam to that they don't have to pay for it. You can't take it that far when it says that it's that everybody has a responsibility for Talmud Torah. You wouldn't be able to spin it in that way.
No, what we're spinning it is that the father's obligation goes beyond that of everyone else. Everybody's obligated to teach this child Torah.
Yeah.
The difference is that the father has to teach b'schar and pay tuition. Everybody else, it's only b'china. Well, let's go on now to the third point. The Avodas HaMelech says the following. Ulanias daiti nira lahosif. Dareal korchach masha omru. Again, he's referring back to the Gemara in Kiddushin Chavtes. Demishal olimdo aviv. The Gemara says in Kiddushin, if we have the time, I'll open up the Gemara, but right now we're going to rely on the Avodas HaMelech. If the son was not taught by his father, chayv lemigmer nafshe, chayv l'lamed es atzmo. He's got to teach his son Torah. So let me just pause for a moment to make a comment here. The Rambam is very strange. The Rambam says that if he wasn't taught by his father, then he has to teach himself Torah. And the Rambam actually quotes a pasuk for that in Halacha Gimel, Shenemar v'ulamadatem osam ushmartem lasosam. Mind you that the Rambam so far has quoted 3 psukim, and now he quotes a 4th pasuk. And what I find extremely bizarre in the Rambam is he never actually says that a person has to study Torah. Only when he gets to Halacha Gimel, in event that the father did not teach his son Torah, then the obligation becomes incumbent on the son himself. And not only that, the Rambam doesn't quote any pasuk, like Vishinantam, etc., but rather he says, I have a new pasuk over here. Very strange. Do you follow what I'm saying? If you want to know about the obligation to study Torah, which seems to be the most fundamental obligation in Talmud Torah, the Rambam gives it to you through the back door. After establishing that the father has to teach his son, the Rambam says, well, in event that the father didn't have to teach his son, then the son becomes obligated on his own to teach himself. So the Avodas HaMelech, getting back to the text over here, he says that if we're talking about just the study of Torah, without indicating or adding the element of financial obligation, then why does the Rambam say that his father didn't teach him Torah? And let's say his father did teach him Torah. So therefore what? He's potter from the mitzvah of Talmud Torah. He doesn't have to study Torah because his father taught him? Meaning, it's pashut that there's an independent obligation on a person to study Torah. Whether his father taught him Torah or didn't teach him Torah is irrelevant. I mean, the Torah is endless. And not only that, the father's going to teach him Mikra, which is Torah Shebechsav. He, the son, is going to have to learn Torah Shebal Peh for the rest of his life. The Rambam later on in the Talmud Torah is going to say how he divides up every day, 1/3 for this, and 1/3 for that, and 1/3 for this. So therefore, if the Rambam would understand that the chiyuv to teach oneself Torah is bechinam, meaning he doesn't have to spend money on that, harigam b'im limdo aviv mechuyev lilmod. Even if his father taught him Torah, he'd have to study. Now, I want to emphasize a few words here in the text. He says, Al karchach b'schar ayri. When the Gemara says that if his father didn't teach him Torah, then he has to study Torah himself, it's b'schar. Meaning that the son now steps into the shoes of his father, and just like his father had to teach him b'schar, he now picks up that chiyuv, that monetary obligation, to teach himself Torah b'schar. And that's why the Rambam introduces this with the following clause, Misha lo limdo aviv. Because again, if the subject here is bechinam, without introducing the financial obligation, then afilu im limdo aviv. It wouldn't make any difference whether his son, well, the father taught the son, or the son never got anything from his father. He still has to teach himself Torah. But rather, the chiddush here, the Rambam, is schar. And that's how the Rambam learned the Gemara Kedusha. That im lo limdo aviv chayv l'lamed esatzon b'schar, meaning that now the obligation, as it were, on the father now transfers over to the son. In absence of the father, meaning if the father didn't do what he had to do, for whatever reason, I'm not going into that, that's irrelevant to us, then that obligation of the fathers now transfers over to the son. So what was apparently the obligation of the father? The obligation of the father was to pay schar. Again, I always add the proviso in event that he can't teach his son personally, face to face. And now that obligation, because the father reneged, now the son, says the Rambam, picks up that obligation. And that's exactly what the Gemara in Kiddushin was establishing. Just give me a minute, excuse me, because...
And
Right, good. Oh, so here's the way the Avodas HaMelech wants to read the Rambam. Mishalo limdo aviv. And the Gemara says in Kiddushin that if his father didn't teach him, he has to teach himself. The subject is the monetary obligation. So what is the word kishayakir? Says the Avodas HaMelech, that you take the letters of the word kishayaker, and you realize that the printer accidentally, again, this is my embellishment of the Avodas HaMelech, maybe we'll get a chance to read it inside, accidentally thought that the bays at the beginning of this word was a chaf. The bays and the chaf look very similar. So instead of reading it bischar, the printer read it kishayakir. So let's say, for example, very often in the printing, if ink falls, it looks like a yud, like a dot is like a yud. So if you are oblivious to the two yuds, the yudin, no pun intended, yudin, then you read it kishayakir, becomes bischar. Do you follow? The shin becomes a sin, right? Because there's no difference between a shin and a sin. Then you have the chaf, skipping the yud, and then you have the resh. The chaf at the beginning becomes, the beis at the beginning becomes a chaf. Let me get that again. The chaf at the beginning becomes a beis, and you read it bischar. So now the whole thrust of the Rambam is, and for that matter, the thrust of the Gemara is that in the event that the father did not live up to his obligation, that obligation now transfers over to the son, and he's going to have to pay for his own Torah education. Fundamentally, if things had gone smooth in the right normal way, then the father would have taken care of the financial obligation to set up Talmud Torah for his son by paying him a lamed. But in an event that the father reneges and he's out of the picture, so now everything transfers over to the son, and the son is now chayiv to pay tuition for his education. So what we gain now from the Avodas HaMelech, if we're willing to buy into his thesis, is two things. Number one, we now understand where the Rambam derived the conclusion that the father has to pay schar, because otherwise, what did the Gemara mean when it said that we now move over to the son himself? I mean, obviously the son is obligated in Talmud Torah. The chiddush is that he picks up his father's chiyuv to pay schar. And number two, we get rid of the word kishayakir, because the truth of the matter is we don't know what the word kishayakir means. And just to show you how baffling the word kishayakir, if you accept it as it's printed on the page, how baffling it is, there are those commentaries who thought that the Rambam is telling you that even before his bar mitzvah, the child is obligated to study Torah. The father's out of the picture. The child is, let's say, 10, 11, 12, I don't know how old he is, but kishayakir means he has some understanding or capacity to make sense out of the Torah, and then the son, becomes obligated. And amongst the commentaries, I found the Mishnah Kesef, who lived about 300 years ago. He says, how could it be? A child is not chayiv in any mitzvah. So katan is potem in a mitzvah. La bar chiyuvahu. And now the Rambam is saying, no, the mitzvah Talmud Torah is different. And keep in mind, the Rambam quotes a pasuk for this, implying that we're dealing with the Doraisa. So now we have a chiyuv Doraisa to teach, a chiyuv Doraisa that's incumbent on a child before his bar mitzvah. If I were to ask you, my father-in-law of Hashem used to love to have, he had these quiz questions in Torah that he would always ask, the young people wherever he saw them. So here's a quiz question to ask a young person. Show me a precedent in one mitzvah that a child before his bar mitzvah is obligated min Torah to fulfill that mitzvah. You're going to get a lot of blank stares. But there is one approach to this Rambam that says that even before the child reaches bar mitzvah, he's obligated midoraisa to study Torah once he gets to the level of mishayaki, whatever that means. And in my mind, I thought that if you go with that mahalach, again, that's not the Avodas HaMelech, then maybe you could quote a famous tshuva, the Chassam Sofer, who asks, when does a ben Noach become responsible for his actions? Because the shear of gadlus is halacha Moshe Sinai, meaning for a boy 13, for a girl 12, and halacha Moshe Sinai doesn't apply to a ben Noach. So when is gadlus for a ben Noach? And basically, the Chassam Sofer develops a thesis that a ben Noach becomes responsible for his actions, and by the way, will be put to death, if he's mature enough to understand the law. For some, it might be at the age of 10. For others, it might be the age of 50. You don't know. You'd have to know in each case. But the Avodas HaMelech is obviously on the other side of the equation. He's refusing to understand that the child becomes obligated as a child, but rather he wants to take out the word kishayakir and read it as bischar. And if you read it as bischar, then what the Rambam is trying to say is that a person whose father didn't teach him Torah now steps into his father's shoes, and just like the father had to pay tuition, now the son has to pay tuition. All right, we run out of time now, so we'll end now. And I want to look this over again with your permission and see if we can possibly, make some sense out of it. All right,
quick question, just a quick question.
Oh, yes.
That this V'chayev l'shchar, he was saying that it really should be part of mitzvah beis at one point, but now it seems like it really has to be part of mitzvah gimel because it's explaining the whole.
No, not at all. It's an integral to halacha beis, because the Rambam is establishing that in the mitzvah of Talmud Torah, whether it's the father vis-a-vis his son, or the son in event of his father to teach vis-a-vis himself, is b'schar. And that answers the Rambam's question why I needed to upgrade the father's obligation through the pasuk of V'limadatem Osam, as opposed to ben chavero, as opposed to V'limadatem Shinantam L'kol Talmidim.
I understand, but it's